Many of you know we've actually been in this sermon series called For the City, and you've been hearing different stories from people in our congregation about kind of what God is doing in our midst. And I wanted to introduce William Mack to you. He's part of our leadership team, which is kind of like our elder board here, which kind of I report to, and so I'm so grateful for. And so would you give it up for William Mack as he comes on up here? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Drew. Good morning. I wanted to share with you some of what God's doing in my heart, moved my heart in this campaign, this For the City campaign. And it really comes from a perspective that I think I've gained as a parent. And sometimes I think God reveals things to us at different times in our lives, and it's always interesting and helpful and insightful to kind of hear that from other people's perspectives. So I wanted to share that with you. And it takes me back to when my kids were really little, and they were old enough to feed themselves Cheerios. And they were probably like 1 year old. And sometimes to the disapproval of my wife, I would carry out these social experiments on my kids. And so what I would do is they're eating the Cheerios, and I'd see them, and they're really happy, and they're enjoying their Cheerios, is that I would ask them, "Can Daddy have a Cheerio?" And you know, there's various ranges of responses that a child could give in that sort of situation. They could just shake their head and say, "No, these are my Cheerios." Or "Mine" is one of the first words I discovered our kids learn. But they would sometimes pick up that Cheerio out of their bowl and offer it to me. And of course, it's with their cute little fingers that are covered with saliva from eating, you know, with their fingers. And I didn't honestly really want to take that Cheerio out of their saliva-covered hands. But I would, because it's part of developing that relationship of love and trust with them. And, you know, they had no idea that I had a whole box of Cheerios in the pantry, and, you know, that I really didn't need their Cheerios. And as they get older, they grow out of this phase of, you know, Cheerios being the source of their happiness. And hopefully they learn there are other things in life that are more valuable than Cheerios. And they realize, you know, sharing Cheerios is actually not that difficult because there's a whole box of them in the pantry. But imagine, and this is the thing that sort of kind of struck me as I felt God sort of revealing this to me. Imagine if one of my kids, and two of them are teenagers now, so I was actually picturing one of them doing this, still thought that Cheerios was the essence to their happiness in life. And they started collecting boxes of unopened Cheerios in their room, and they were so sort of intent on building up their storehouse of Cheerios. I think, you know, if any of you heard that was true, you'd think that was a little sad, probably. And the analogy is probably not lost on you. That's the Father's heart. And even in the idea of, you know, their response in my invitation to share Cheerio, it's not that my love for them is dependent on whether they share the Cheerio or not. It's really about inviting them to join into this sort of relationship of trust. And in many ways, sometimes the things we value apart from God are like those Cheerios. And that thought informs my thinking as I think about this campaign. And as I think about my response to the For the City opportunity, I think first of all, it's an amazing opportunity to be able to invest in real estate at half the price that it would typically take. And I was imagining, wow, what would be something equivalent to that? It would be almost as if Jeff Bezos, he's the founder and CEO of Amazon.com. I think most of us know what Amazon is. We just survived Cyber Monday and Black Friday for the week prior. It's almost as if Jeff called Drew and say, "Hey, Drew, I'm trying to, I love what you're doing at Hope. I want to offload these shares in Amazon at half the price. Are you interested?" And Drew says, "Yes, absolutely." And then Drew kind of turns to us and says, "Who's in?" You know, he's this general guy who wants to share this opportunity to sort of, you know, invest in Amazon shares at half the price, except that this is 10 years ago before Amazon was as big as it was now. And that's sort of how I feel about this opportunity. You know, in addition to it being at half the price, we actually don't know, and it's hard to fathom the returns we're going to see in people's lives over the years through this space. You know, making room for God to do something miraculous and amazing for years to come. We could be looking at not 2x, but 10x or 100x. We just have no idea. And God's in it, so his multiplication factor is pretty significant. And so it seems like an amazing opportunity when I kind of consider all of those elements. But really what it draws me back to at the end of the day is God, my Father, inviting me to share my Cheerios with him. Not because he needs my Cheerios, but because he's inviting me to join into a deeper relationship of trust and love with him. So I'll leave that with you. Thank you.
William. Yeah, so grateful for William to share his words. And as we've been in this For the City campaign, we've really been talking about this dynamic of what does it mean to live faith-filled lives. Now, if you're not a Christian here, or maybe you're relatively new to our church and you're wondering, oh man, what have I gotten myself into by being here today? I want you to know this, that when it comes to this topic of money and generosity, it's something that every single one of us wrestle with and deal with, especially living in this town. Because this town, I mean, money, what it does is it taunts you and me every single day, doesn't it? I mean, with the cost of food, with the cost of parking, with the cost of everything else that this city costs, it haunts us every day, and it taunts us. And money does this to us, whether you're religious or you're not. And one of the things that we've been talking about is this idea of faith. And living with faith, there must be tangible actions that come with faith-filled living. But the reality is, for many of us, and again, if you're religious or you're not, every single one of us has faith in something. For some of us, our faith is in our career. Our faith is in our intellect. Our faith is in the New York Knicks front office. No, it's not. But some of us, our faith is in all sorts of different things. And whether you're someone who's religious or you're not, you would probably agree that the things that we put faith in are often the valuable things that we kind of put our money towards. And so we often put our money towards our savings, towards investment. And money somehow gives us all this feeling of security, this feeling of comfort, this feeling of approval. And so it's not actually the tactile thing of money that we're talking about here. We're talking about all the stuff that money provides for us. And in many ways, the one tangible thing that we've been talking about when it comes to exercising faith is where do you and where do we put our money? Because at the end of the day, our money talks. And we have this phrase, put your money where your mouth is. And we have that phrase because at the end of the day, where we put our money ends up revealing a whole lot about us. I shared from this immigrant background that I came from. Money had such claws in me because it was all about saving money, because I'll never have enough money, because I come from this immigrant background, and therefore I was always told, you will never have enough money. And so the arguments between my wife and I are basically about, like, how much toilet paper are we going to buy? Hey, we don't need to use that much toilet paper every time we go to the bathroom, right? Like, I know, a little bit TMI there. But nonetheless, right, like those are the kinds of conversations I'm having because of the taunting that money does in my life, the taunting that says you'll never have enough money. Now, for others of us, money's different, the way it gives us status and approval. And what we've been exploring is how, in many ways, money can be the sum of what we are putting our faith in. And what we've been inviting you towards, that's bigger than this For the City campaign, is this reflection of, like, how about your life? Where is your faith? Where is my faith? This is the introduction that we've been giving to you. Now, with that said, we read a passage earlier about the story of someone named Esther. And as we kind of culminate this series of For the City, and as we call people towards this decisive moment of saying, hey, will you walk in faith? I thought this story was a very appropriate one, and you'll see why. Now, the story of Esther is a story that's about 479 BC or so. So it's post-exile, and there's a remnant of Jewish people who are living in Persia, in the capital of Susa. Now, Esther is this Jewish woman who somehow, providentially, ends up arising to be the queen of King Xerxes. Now, Esther is also related to a fellow by the name of Mordecai. Mordecai is his cousin. Due to a number of different events, what happens is the king provides this edict that all the Jewish people should be killed and slaughtered. So in other words, institutes like this kingdom-wide genocide of the Jews. Now here's this moment though, where Mordecai, whose cousin Esther, is actually in a seat of influence. She is a queen, and perhaps she has the king's ear. But it comes to this moment where Mordecai is basically saying, hey, Esther, I'm calling you to actually stand in the gap on behalf of the Jewish people. Because if you do not, guess what? Many Jews will actually lose their lives. Now, in this exchange, check out what happens. It says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, and Esther's words were basically like, actually, the king doesn't allow anyone to see them without an appointment. I haven't had an appointment yet. And basically, she's essentially saying, if I were to go into the king's presence, it could cost my life. I could die. Now, when Esther reports this to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. So I want you to know, even though you're in the king's house, it might not be you alone, right? And then he says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Now, what's interesting about the book of Esther, not once is God mentioned at all. And so it's interesting because the book of Esther is this historical account that are in the Holy Scriptures, and yet God is not actually talked about not once in this whole story. And the reason why is because in this narrative, what it weaves together is this idea that no matter what situations we might find ourselves in, God is always working. And so even in this statement that Mordecai gives, when he basically says, if you remain silent, listen, if you don't do anything, if you end up choosing your own self-preservation more than stepping in on behalf of the Jews, if you do that, listen, deliverance will come because God is great. God is sovereign. God is in control. God has delivered his people. God doesn't need you. God doesn't need me because we're just mere human beings. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows? But that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Here's what Mordecai is basically saying. Listen, deliverance will come. People will die, though. But why else would God have put you in this position right now, today, for such a time as this? High five your neighbor and say, for such a time as this. And here's what Mordecai is basically saying, that each one of us, in kind of the tapestry of our lives, we come to these moments where there's this moment where we can choose to walk in faith into what God has called us to, or to simply ignore the position that we're in and to go about our way. And Esther has this phenomenal moment because there's this moment where basically she's choosing. Will you stand in the gap in generous sacrifice of others, your people? Or will you simply kind of live out of self-preservation and continue to be safe as a queen and have a wonderful life? And here's what Mordecai is basically saying. You've got this opportunity right in front of you. Mordecai is saying is, but what in the world would have led to circumstances such as this? So that right now, right here, you have an opportunity to walk into something with great faith. Now look at what happens. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. It's about to go down. I mean, isn't this phenomenal? Here's this woman who takes this call and this challenge. Will she step into a divine destiny of faith and of courage? Or will she cower to her own kind of self-wants, her own desperation, her own self-pursuits? And she says, no, I'm going to walk in faith with great courage and sacrifice. into this moment for such a time as this. You know, these moments come to us, each of us. These moments come where God calls us to live into a life of sacrifice and generosity beyond our own moments of simply self-preservation or self-pursuit. And one of the things that marks people of faith, and again, if you're not a Christian here, guess what? You get to hear about what this Christian faith is all about. This Christian faith is this belief that we live for something bigger than ourselves. And for Esther, it's this call, will you step into faith in this moment for such a time as this? You know, we each need these moments in our lives to be asking ourselves, am I living with a faith-filled kind of walk? Or am I someone who's simply living like the rest of everyone else in the culture that we live in and the people that we're around? And one of the things that's bigger than this campaign, because I know that we've been talking about this campaign, and I truly believe that this facility, that there was a walkthrough yesterday, and we had different people coming through the walkthrough, and there were such dreams bubbling up in this space because of the enormous opportunity before us. And you know, I truly believe that it's a wonderful investment that's going to go and give far greater returns than what we're even sowing into it. But for Tina and I, my wife and I, we came to this moment where we've been asking, God, what is this moment that you're calling us into? How can this For the City campaign be something bigger than simply just a building that we're going into? Now, I've shared my story about how when I first moved to New York in 2001, I raised $7,500, so I wasn't even hired. The church that hired me was to become an intern, and then they offered for me to raise my own salary. And I was like, that's not really an offer. That's like, I don't know what that is, but that's not offering me much, you know? And so that's what I did. So I raised $7,500, and I lived in Flushing with two other guys, and I basically scraped my way by living off of that salary for the entire year. Now, here's the thing. Guess what? Because you've probably heard that I'm a penny pincher, that was something that, hey, this is right in my wheelhouse. I could live off of $7,500 a year. I could do that, and I did it the first year. Now, that whole fear that was in me, this idea of money and like, will I ever have enough? It was so kind of steeped in me that it was really hard, and I had to scrape and make ends meet. Now, here's what's happened, right? Because 18 years later, here I am, and as we've been in this kind of generosity initiative, what I've mentioned to you all is that some of you are like, I can't believe this church is talking about money so much. And I told you, listen, it's not, I don't want your money. I don't need your money. I told you that my wife is independently wealthy, so I don't need your money. I'm actually living pretty well here in the city because my wife is wealthy. And so there you go. And so it's not like whatever money you give is not supporting like my wife and I. And so just in full disclosure here today, I'm going to tell you what my salary is. My salary, I've told you that it's half of what most Midtown pastors make. My salary is $85,000 a year. So that's how much I get for being the pastor of this church. Now, again, that's half of what most Midtown pastors make of a church our size. Now, some of you are like, I should have really become a pastor. Now, but here's the thing. So that's how much we make. That's how much we make in this church community. Now, I want you to know this. Like, so Tina and I, like, we're in a situation financially that's way different than what it was back in 2001 when I first moved here as an intern, as a single guy living in this bunk bed in Queens. It's a much different situation, but you know what? Those taunts about money, it's still in me. Drew, you won't have enough. Drew, your kids won't have enough. Oh, Drew, you can't make your kids go through what you went through. And I'm telling you, the ways in which I thought that I was free from money. No, it's still in me. It doesn't matter how much money I have. 18 years later, it's still in me. Now, of course, this is why when we talk about generosity, and we talked about kind of the order of give, save, spend. For most of us, it's spend, then save, then give maybe whatever you have left. Or for some of us, I told you that my order was basically save first, and then you spend, and then you give a little bit. But see, for me, one of the things, and one of the reasons why we had to make give kind of the first part of that equation was not because I'm this super holy person, but it's because I know that the tentacles of money are so deep within me. They taunt me every single day in this city. And I'm guessing they taunt you as well, because this city is dang expensive. And you and I know that whatever profession you're in, the taunt and the allure of more money, more security, more kind of, hey, do you see how much money I manage? Or whatever that taunt might be related to money, you and I know this city taunts us every single day. And this is why we've been talking about how this is a deeply spiritual issue. And it's a deeply spiritual issue for me. So for my wife and I, we came to this moment then when it comes to this for the city, for such a time as this, we've really been approaching this moment, not so much like, hey, like we're, trying to invest in this building. We've been asking God, what is this moment that you're calling us to? Now, there's different ways to give, and one of the things that we've been talking about in the different dessert gatherings is there's basically 3 different ways. There's kind of the reasonable amount. Some of you, maybe you've walked in today and you said, oh, there's a reasonable amount that I can give above and beyond. And maybe for some of you, maybe the call is for you to start being generous somewhere. But either way, there's kind of the reasonable amount, right? Like it's reasonable that I can maybe scrape a couple of dollars per week over 26 months and make this happen. That might be reasonable. Then for others of you, there's this reprioritizing. There's this moment where you've basically said, I'm going to prioritize being generous over 1 extra cup of coffee per week or something. And as a result, you're thinking, okay, as you do the economics of it, you reprioritize how much you're given. And the third thing, which is a third thing that for my wife and I, as we were thinking of these different categories, what does generosity look like for us in this stage of our life? What is this moment calling us to? For my wife and I, it was for such a time as this moment. What does faith-filled living look like? What does rely on God generosity look like? How can we rely on God? If we were to measure kind of walking in faith into something that feels foolishly faith-filled, what does that look like? And so for Tina and I, as we were praying about this, and both of us independently, I remember when we came to this moment, as we were thinking about inviting our church into this moment to sow generously so that we can bless generations of New Yorkers, what does this look like for us? And so we said, what does rely on God look like? It was astounding because my wife and I came to the same figure. It was essentially that we'd give 2 years of my salary from this church. So we said that we would walk together and give $170,000 above and beyond what we normally give. So we're completely giving out of our savings now towards this cause. And here's what we believe. We believe that this moment was not a calling for us to say like, hey, look at how great we are. Look at how awesome we are. Look at how holy. No, we wanted to say, what does it look like? What does rely on God faith look like? And how can I begin to step into that? Some of us have asked this question, like, God hasn't moved in my life in extraordinary ways. Well, maybe it's because whenever God has invited you into a faith-filled moment, you have not stepped in. And one of the things that Tina and I have been reflecting on is, gosh, bigger than simply a building at this moment, what are you calling us to live a life of rely on God kind of faith? And so here's what I want to do. I wanted to actually show this video, and it's a video of a guy named Graham who actually lives here in the city. We've exchanged some text messages, and he shares his own story and journey of faith related to finances as well. And so if you could turn your attention to the screen as we watch this story, a guy named Graham Smith, as he shares his story at a conference in Atlanta.
Hi, everybody. I'm Graham, and I'm nervous. I currently work on Wall Street in New York City, and although I'm on Wall Street, it wasn't too long ago that I was studying theology and economics at Wheaton College. Any Wheaton alumni in here? So generosity wasn't something that always came naturally to me at college. I didn't have much money, and so the time I did have, I mostly spent it on my studies, pursuing future goals. Generosity was always deferred for me. Someday when I have influence or a job or power or money, then I can give back and contribute to others. I remember listening to a well-known theologian, N.T. Wright, come to Wheaton College, and he spoke about how Christians are called to follow Jesus' example and love even if it's to the point of death. And he gave the example of early Christians in Asia Minor during the Roman Empire reacted to the coming plague in their cities by staying in the cities and caring for those that were affected by the plague, whereas the rich and well-to-do would flee the city because of the plague. Oftentimes, these Christians, often caring for the poorest, would stay in the city with the plague, sometimes catch the plague and die themselves. But the point was made graphically and unmistakably to me. This was a different way to be human, and giving away your life, even to the point of death, was following the way of the cross. So what did giving your life away to the point of death look for a recent college grad? During my senior year, right before my Wall Street offer, I was moved by a husband and wife who served in the Middle East. They modeled what living sacrificially looked like for me. This couple spends their time going through war-torn areas of the Middle East to support and love those who are suffering there. I actually found myself weeping in my senior year class as I heard stories of sacrifice and complete giving their lives away to others in the name of God. For me in that moment, I knew that I had to think hard about what living sacrificially would look like on Wall Street. So I had 2 months between graduation and starting my job on Wall Street. So I decided I'd spend it in Uganda living with rural farmers and try to understand the struggles they face there. I finished my work in the Ugandan jungle for 2 months and caught a plane to the concrete jungle, New York. I had the smell of Uganda on me as I sat in the room of investment bankers as we started our first year as analysts. Everybody was so confused at everyone, where did you come from? Oh, vacation here, vacation there. And then I would say Uganda, and everyone was so confused. I had committed in my heart to God to live sacrificially, and for me this meant giving 90% of each of my paycheck away, or reverse tithing. It also meant that the 10% I did keep, I invested it in cash flow generating assets so I could give each month's cash flow also away. So every 2 weeks you would get paid, and even with my analyst salary, I had such meaningful and joyful experiences finding places to give it away before my 2 weeks would be up, because then you get paid again. One of the most meaningful giving opportunities has been funding my dad, who's a believer, his bucket list, because he has Parkinson's disease. It's hard to express the joy of being able to financially support your dad's hopes and dreams that still inside him, even as his body fights this disease. Now, I mentioned I do reverse tithing of giving 90% away. I used to think that I would invest all my money in investments so I could grow them and nurture them, and that way one day you could give away more. But for me, I honestly feel that in my heart of hearts, I would view that growing net worth, that growing investment portfolio as my own child, where I put so much effort to grow it and raise it and take care of it, that really when it was really big someday, could I really sacrifice that child that I, so to speak, had raised? So I also think that my investments might blow up. You never know what you're investing in, as so many saw in the financial crisis. But I think investing in people lasts forever. I also think that for me, that if I don't set patterns now as a young adult, just starting my paycheck, it'll never happen. So it's also a form of discipline in learning how to give. The other side of the equation is minimizing costs, which that's my bunk bed I sleep in. So because everyone knows living in Manhattan, it can get pricey. All of my coworkers that are my peer group that work next to me, they can afford nice apartments, and so everyone always is confused that I sleep in a bunk bed. So they actually have a name for this of having to spend so much money in New York City. They call it the golden handcuffs, where you develop such an expensive lifestyle. One of my colleagues has 2 apartments, one for work, one for living, and one for play, where he invests in all sorts of play activities. So you can imagine how expensive that gets. So you can't ever afford to quit your job. You get handcuffed, the golden handcuffs. So I currently pay the rent someone would pay in Uganda for sleeping in a bunk bed. I share my apartment with 4 other Christian people, so we all love each other, and it's been a great community. And another way of minimizing costs is finding free haircuts on Craigslist. You would not believe how many free haircuts there are in Manhattan of rising hair people that need free, they need free hair models that don't mind a bad haircut every now and then. But in all seriousness, it's been so much joy finding little ways to cut costs in order to give more each 2 weeks. Many of my friends ask me if this is hard or I regret my decision. It's hard to say. This lifestyle was a conscious choice, but it brings so much joy that I don't know what I would be doing, what I'd be missing out on without this giving. And here's a picture of Jeff, because I've also had the discovery of not just giving away money, but also giving away other things: hospitality, power, time. My first run-in with this was befriending a homeless man who always sat outside my office at Credit Suisse at Madison Square Park. We became friends, and one time when I tried offering him financial support, he looked at me sternly and said, "Graham, the only thing you can give me is your friendship. I can't accept anything from you because I want that boundary between me and our friendship." So about once a month, we'll have him over for dinner and just enjoy time with him. So instead of spending my time trying to get ahead in my field or spending time trying to find the next big paying job in the hedge fund world, I have found so much joy spending time on things like friendship, things like hospitality. Our apartment has 2 extra couches, so people pass through the city all the time since it's New York City, and we have so much fun hosting them. And with regards to power, now that I'm inside a company, it's been so fun to help other Wheaton grads that are interested in finance to pass on their resumes to the HR and consider advocating for other students that are Christians interested in finance. So overall, I just wanted to share how excited I am to live as a pastor with hedge fund money, as someone once spoke about it, and seeking to view money like manure. Don't let it pile up, but spread it around. Thank you.
All right. So here's a question I want to ask you and me and everyone here. And here's a question. Why not us? Why not now? You know, I think oftentimes we reserve kind of like, oh, well, that's Graham Smith, everyone. Like, that's just kind of like a step of faith that's beyond what I have. Well, why not us? Why not you? Why not me? And why not now? What would it look like for us to say, God, we want to see you do extraordinary things when we've sown with great faith? Why not us? Why not now? What if the story that God is writing in your life, and the story that God is writing in my life, and the story that God is writing in our life collectively as a church community is a story of just uncommon generosity, of uncommon faith? That to a city out there that says, no, live for your self-pursuits and live for your self-interest, that we were people that said, you know what? We actually want to live for the good of our city and for the good of our world. Now, here's the thing. Like, some of you are like, wow, Drew, you're really throwing these haymakers of guilt on me right now. And you're probably wondering, like, when is this going to end? You know what's so fascinating about the Christian story, though, is that the Christian story has never been this moralistic, hey, do this, or else God's going to be disappointed in you. And I would dare not ever come with that kind of heavy hand, but instead, the good news of faith has always been this belief that God, who owns everything, where deliverance can come just like that, but he invites us into the story, as William was talking about earlier. You know what's amazing is the Apostle Paul, who's one of the early leaders of Christianity. Check out what he says in the book of Galatians. He says, when the set time had fully come, when the time had fully come, when the moment of God giving the evidence that he was for us and not against us, when that time had fully come, look at what it says. God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship or daughtership. Because you are his sons and daughters, God sent the Spirit of his Son, Jesus, into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Daddy, Abba, Father. You are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. Isn't this good? You see, the foundation of the Christian journey has always been, you see, one of the ways that we gain freedom from the tentacles that money has in you and in me, one of the ways that we gain freedom from all the ways in which our anxieties lead us with clenched fists to live our lives is God says, hey, you're my son and you're my daughter. You're a son and a daughter of the God who created everything. He's got everything. And you can call out to him, Daddy, Abba, Father. And when we can actually begin to place our trust in God and not in our money, not in our intellect, not in our potential net worth. I mean, do you see the freedom that we can actually begin to live with? Do you see the lightness and the levity? Do you see the hopefulness that we can now begin to entrust our lives to a good dad?